Right, we are now going to look at the Atlantic economy, the so-called triangle trade. And I want you to know that it's not really a perfect triangle, but the point is that the North American colonies were intertwined into the British mercantilist system. And what that means, and we'll go into mercantilism here in just a little bit, but the the British Empire, in terms of trade, was all interconnected, and England wanted that trade to stay within the English Empire. In other words, they did not want the wealth to go to its competitors, because in mercantilism, you believe that there's a finite amount of wealth and that it should stay within the empire. And so there was a tremendous amount of trade going on between the Caribbean, between North America, between Africa and England. And you can see some of it here. The colonies were primarily, their role in this whole thing was, raw materials. So you see whale oil, lumber, furs, rice, silk, indigo, tobacco, that stuff kind of going to Europe, and then down to the Caribbean, they would send foodstuffs. So things like fish and wheat and corn and anything to help to feed slaves in the Caribbean sugar islands. And then, of course, Africa, they would supply the labor, and they would be paid in terms of gold. They would be paid in terms of guns, manufactured goods from Europe. Right, we're now going to switch our attention to New England society. And I've already talked about some of this, so some of it I'll go through a little more quickly than others. But remember that for the most part, at least in the early part of New England's history, and it's mostly Puritans, and even the people that aren't a part of the Puritan church, they are more or less forced to go to the Puritan church. They pay taxes to the Puritan church. And so the Puritans really dominate New England's culture. We talked about in class the Protestant work ethic, about how to gain favor from God, you really had to toe this social line. So you had to work very hard, up in the morning and work hard all day. And then, you had to be frugal. But even that's a little bit contradictory, because, the wealthy people in New England did kind of display their wealth. They wanted to show that God gave them favor. But for the most part, they were pretty frugal. In terms of the demographic composition, remember that New England is made up mostly of English people that were Puritan, and so there's not a lot of Dutch, there's not a lot of French, there's very little diversity when compared to like the middle colonies, or say even the South, where you have more slaves after Bacon's Rebellion, and so you just have more of a homogeneous society, at least in the early part of the colonial period. Family structure is way more stable than the South. The male to female ratio is much lower. Remember that these people came as families. They live in a healthier environment. It's colder. Pathogens do not do as well as they did in the South. And so you could expect a higher life expectancy. Few mothers died in childbirth. More babies lived through their first year. And so you have a lower infant mortality rate. In terms of families, they're more stable. You could expect to have both of your parents live. You'd maybe even have in New England, you'd have grandparents, which is almost unheard of in the South. And typically you'd have, because the church didn't allow lower divorce rates, they did still have premarital pregnancies, but not nearly as many as in the South. And then we talked about this in class, that women, they didn't have hardly any authority anywhere, but compared to their Chesapeake counterparts, women had less authority. They couldn't own property. They couldn't enter into contracts. They couldn't sue in a court of law. And so really, they were pretty much given inferior status to the landowning males. Okay. In terms of the New England economy, remember that everywhere we go in the colonies, farming is the number one job, no matter what. So I don't want you guys to think that people did not farm in New England. They did. They farmed everywhere. But It's on a smaller scale than the South, so you would rarely see anything that resembled a plantation. Um, but then you start to see what we would call a diverse economy. And so you would see shipbuilding, you would see artisanal stuff. So if you take a look at the picture in the top right hand corner of your screen, you'll see some textile industry starting to be created, and artisans, so people that made stuff with their hands, coopers, blacksmiths, potters, tailors, cobblers. Those people were more prevalent in New England than they were in the South. Again, not to say that the South didn't have those people, but they were few and far between compared to New England. Really, a huge difference between New England's economy and the South economy is this idea of the merchant class. And so you have this emerging merchant class in not only New England, but just all over north of the southern colonies. So everywhere from Philadelphia to Providence to Boston to New York, you have this merchant class that is really not that big in the South, other than maybe Savannah or Charleston. And those shippers, those merchants, they're going to become the wealthy people. And instead of plantation owners running the northern government, to a large degree, it's going to be the merchants. Shipbuilding was very big in the North, not only to help the merchants to be able to do what they do, but then England expected that the vast forests that are in the New England area, they had tall, skinny pines that could be used as ship masts, and so those were cut down and shipped off to England, and it created quite an economy for New England. Okay, in terms of farming, most of the farmers were not much beyond subsistence farmers, and so corn, wheat, barley, and then various forms of livestock, usually pigs and cattle. Okay, and we talked about the artisans and cottage industries. There was not a lot of industry, not a lot of manufacturing at this time, and the British did not want manufacturing. One notable exception to this was a pretty large ironworks, and the Saugus Ironworks, and they turned out pots and nails and plows and other things made of metal, but you just didn't see that very much in the northern economies. It just Britain did not want us to develop that way. They wanted to be the ones that manufactured goods, and they wanted us to supply them with cheap raw materials, and then they would make stuff out of them, and they typically sell them back to us. So we focused in what we call extractive industries, and so this is basic stuff. So this is farming, fishing, mining, and logging. I mean, that's really what Great Britain expected us to do, is farming, fishing, mining, and logging, and they didn't really want us to manufacture that much. Okay, and there you can see specifically some of the things that New England, cod was a big one, crabbing, lobstering, and then naval stores, timber, pitch, tar, resin. Tar and resin, these are things to help with making ropes, waterproofing the ropes, waterproofing the boats. And so really the New England area became kind of a hotbed for anything that had to do with putting boats together. Again, extractive industries, the mining of iron was something that was done more in the North than the South at this time. And then it was shipped off usually to England to be manufactured into something. Okay, in terms of New England, the way that towns were set up differently than in the South. To recall that in the South, you have these big, wide, massive rivers that were very deep, and you could go up literally with a big ship hundreds of miles into the interior. New England's different. Their rivers are swift moving. They're not very deep. They're not very wide. And so along the coast, you would get these harbor cities or harbor towns where commerce would have to kind of come in and go in and out of, and that's where it'd have to be unloaded and loaded onto boats. But in terms of what the Puritans set up, remember that they are there to worship together. They are there as a communal bond with God, and so they believe that they are to create these tight, knit communities bound together by the promise to God. So they really plan out these towns, and I'm going to show you a picture here in just a second. But some hallmark features of every New England town. And you're probably going to start with a church. Church is going to be in the center of the town. It's going to be the centerpiece building. People are going to go there quite regularly throughout the week. Some people almost every day. So the church is really the prominent building in the center of town. And then you would have what's called a town common, where you would have common grazing area for things like cattle. You would have, if the town's large enough, you would have a town meeting hall and maybe even a school that was supported by taxes. And even though public schools, they did take a while to develop, they're definitely going to develop first in New England. And typically the schools' main purpose was get their kids to read so that they could read scripture. I mean, the most important thing for them was to be able to be literate enough to read the Bible. And that's really, there wasn't much more to school at this time, but at least that's a start for public schools. There was less stratification in society. Remember in class we talked about how in the South you have these plantation owners that, they own 50 or more acres of land, and disproportionately they control the powers of government. We really, in New England, even though there are wealthy people, and even though there's, like, I guess you could say, middle class or lower class, really there's less of a gap between the rich and poor. And that is reflected in the distribution of land, where they really had, relatively speaking, more equal plots of land, at least compared to what was being given out in the South. We talked about the importance of schools. We'll see the development of certain colleges and universities. And again, mostly those colleges and universities are dedicated to teaching priests or schools for the Bible. So everything from Harvard, when Yale and Princeton. I mean, really the only school of note that is secular, that is not directly tied to religion, is going to be the University of Pennsylvania. So when Franklin sets up the University of Pennsylvania, it is more of kind of like an Enlightenment school than it is a religious school. But all the other ones that we kind of think of, Brown, Cornell, Columbia, those are all really set up, at least initially, in terms of learning about the Bible and teaching priests. Okay, here you can see a typical New England town. They're very clustered together. This would be a clustered rural settlement. You have the town hall, the school, and the church prominently in the middle, the common as well. And then people would be, they would be given these plots of land outside of the town, and they would have to walk by each other's houses. And so it's really a tight-knit community. And then, every time they go to the church, they're around each other. So unlike the South, where the geography creates a very isolated type atmosphere, this is all about bringing people together and all about, interaction and acting as a community instead of as individuals. All right. Well, not everything went well for New England. Living as strict as they did, we know that they had dissenters such as Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams. And then there are, a couple of other events that took place in New England that caused a certain amount of social unrest. First of all, you started having a situation where the people that were the elect, the people that could vote, the people that were the members of the church, it was very rare for a group of people to witness a conversion experience. And so the members of the church, their children, very often didn't have those conversion experiences, and nobody saw them going through them. So they created this thing called the halfway covenant. And the halfway covenant basically said that if your parents had a conversion experience, if they were members of the church, then you would have basically a halfway membership before you had a conversion experience, because you were never guaranteed that conversion experience. But what this shows really is the weakening of the Puritan church, that they're not going to be able to remain as strict as they did. And as we go on, and as the Enlightenment comes in, this is going to further deteriorate the power of the Puritan church in New England. Of course, we also have the famous Salem witch trials. And really, the Salem witch trials, for as kind of a wacky as an episode this was, and so I'll just give you kind of a brief synopsis of the Salem witch trials, but really you have in the 1690s an atmosphere where you have the social order, and there were certain women who bucked that social order, and these women either were unmarried, or they were women that held prominent positions in society in a time when women just didn't do that, or they spoke out against the church. But whatever the case, many of these women got branded as witches, and the Puritans had always kind of believed in witchcraft and the work of the devil. And so, the tensions that were in society in the 1690s in New England at this time really fed into that. And so what started happening is that these women start getting accused of being witches, and then it becomes, as the name implies, a big witch hunt. And so people, if there was a female that they thought was out of order, out of line, they called them a witch. They were put on trial, and many of them were hanged. What's interesting about this is that several years later, most of the people that were accusers in the Salem witch trials, they admitted that they had totally made it up. And so, it was kind of a big scam. But what's important for us to know is that the Salem witch trials just shows us the Puritans they had a social order, and anybody that went against it, they were kind of cast out as different and as social outcasts. And that's what happened to many of these women that got charged as witches. And I went over all of that already. Okay. I'm going to stop this video, and these videos can only go about 15 minutes before it doesn't record very well. So I am going to start the next one at the growth of Colonial.